Here we are. It's the 20th of March. We passed the Ides of March, which was momentous in itself. And of course, the context is we're here all pretty much locked down and trying to stay safe in the grip of this coronavirus pandemic. So it's an unprecedented time, I think, for many people here. And we've never really seen the economy come to practically a stop. So we're all trying to kind of adjust to what that really means. So I thought, Sally, maybe if you introduce yourself briefly, and then I'll do the same, and then we can get started on our chat.
Of course, Rita. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And I'm Sally Helgesen. I'm an author, a speaker, and a leadership coach. And for 30 years, I've focused primarily on women's leadership and building more inclusive organizations, both in my writing and my work. So I have lots of thoughts and insights about what kind of time that this is for women leaders and for organizations in terms of building the opportunities here to build more inclusive cultures in a time of great stress. So wonderful to be here, and thank you, Rita.
Oh, thank you for making the time. It's always a pleasure. So I'm Rita McGrath. I'm a professor at Columbia Business School, and my main areas of focus are at the intersection between strategy and innovation. But a little kind of side project of mine, which Sally was hugely influential in shaping, is that I direct our executive leadership program for women. It's called Women in Leadership. And it's really about two things. One is, how can women be their own best advocates, change what is in their control, but more importantly, how can they be change agents for their organizations to make the organizations more inclusive and more open to the influence of women, which a mountain of research suggests is absolutely critical to high performance, that when women are not just in the room, but actually listened to and are able to participate. That it makes such a huge difference. So I thought to kick things off, Sally, you said something to me that just really stuck with me, and it even made it into my most recent book, which is about strategic inflection points, which is, you've been studying women's leadership forever, but what we've traditionally thought of as women's leadership, we're now recognizing is really important for leaders in general. So I'd love it if you could maybe expand on that thought.
It's been a fascinating process to watch, Rita, over the last 30 years as demographics, technology, and the nature of the economy, the emphasis on knowledge and innovation, have changed what our understanding is of what constitutes excellence in leadership. And now organizations that are well run or ahead of the curve are all looking for leaders who can inspire trust, facilitate engagement of employees so that they can really bring their hearts and minds and innovative skills. Qualities like listening and empathy and the ability to directly and clearly communicate with people have become ever more important. And just the recognition that an inclusive culture is required to manage a diverse workforce, which is the reality. Diversity and inclusion have gotten paired, but diversity is really the reality of our workforce, and inclusion is the means by which it can be led. So what's been fascinating, I wrote a book in 1990 called The Female Advantage, Women's Ways.
Right over here in my library.
And sort of looked at these skills as representing women's leadership at its best. And at the time, that was always dismissed as, those are soft skills. Those aren't leadership skills. And today, what were formerly seen as soft skills have become leadership skills. And I think we've underplayed the role that women have played in this in terms of shifting the strategy of how organizations motivate and engage their employees and innovate in the world. So it's been a fascinating thing to watch. My old friend Tom Peters always says, what was hard has become soft, and what was soft has become hard. And I think that's the realization of this, that the soft skills are really the hard skills, and they're the ones that organizations need now and will need more than ever going forward.
Mhm. Yeah, and I see that everywhere. One of the most interesting bits of recent work is a book with a very provocative title, "Why So Many Incompetent Men." Have you run across that one?
Oh, yeah, that book is a fascinating book.
I was asked to write a foreword for it, and I was like, I'm not really sure I'm ready to go there. But the author makes a fascinating point, which is that when it comes to leadership, that we tend to confuse confidence with competence, and that very often women are quite happy to be softly, quietly, unglamorously competent, and they don't go, yelling to the skies about it, and they don't promote themselves so much about it. And I was wondering, is there any prospect that that could change, do you think?
I think, one thing I noticed, and I'm fascinated by the role of crisis and how our definitions of leadership evolve. But in 2008, I was at a huge conference in Deauville, a big women's conference, and the consensus of the women was, these guys have been telling us that we had no idea what we were doing, and look what they've done. So it was, and I think that part of that irrational exuberance that preceded 2008 was really a consequence of overconfidence. One of the great points that the author Tommaso Premusic Tomorrow makes in that book that you cite is that the biggest leadership problem in organizations is that they have no idea how to spot overconfidence in men. That they believe that extreme confidence means that he can get the job done, and no matter how many times we see overconfident, it's not confident men that are the problem, it's overconfident men that are the problem. But how many times we've seen them fail, organizations still get fooled. So I think it's very interesting because over the last few years, there's been a big push. What women need is more confidence. We have to build that up, confidence curve and things like that. There's been a lot of talk about that. But I think that what really is needed, above all, and the big lesson for women from this book, is that what we need to do is to be better at articulating and understanding the nature of our competence so that we can convey it clearly. It's not self-promotion, it's what your organization really needs to know.
Mhm. Yeah, and in the Women in Leadership course, we spend a chunk of time trying to get people to really own their own capability, which is a real challenge. Women almost feel like, I get the impression that they feel, oh, gee, if I say how great I am or what I accomplished, that's going to be seen as being promotional or being, you know, I'm going to get pushed down for it or something. And yet, I don't think that's the case at all. I had a wonderful incident with our daughter, in which somebody was asking me about something, and I said, "Oh yeah, I could do that." And she looked at me with these big round eyes, and she said, "Mom, you said that you could just do that?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I've done it about 10,000 times. Why would I not be able to do it now?" But to her at the time, I think she was 22. To her 22-year-old self, that sounded sort of out of character for a woman to say confidently, "I can do that." So that I thought that was very interesting. So what, I mean, we're in this crisis. It's unfolding day by day. It's causing us, I think, to revisit a lot of the taken for granted assumptions that we've built relationships on, that we've built organizations on. What do you think are some of the things that are likely to change as we rethink how we built what we have today?
Well, I really think that what I hear from people, and I'm communicating with people all over the world very broadly on almost a full-time basis since
We're all living on Zoom now.
the work I had disappeared. But my work involves travel, so I'm home and I'm communicating with people on a full-time basis, and it's pretty fascinating. And what I'm hearing from the people, in order to maintain resilience and some degree of hope during this crisis, is we need to appreciate what we have. We need to appreciate and actively connect with the people we know broadly, we can get through this together. And I think that's going to create even more pressure for organizations to build cultures that people perceive to be inclusive. I work with organizations that will say, we're putting into place inclusive, policies, and inclusion is perceived by people, and usually perceived because of leadership behaviors that then get translated down. So I think there may be less tolerance or more notice of behaviors that are not inclusive. So I think there's going to be a pressure on that. Now, as always in a crisis, there's going to be a backlash to that, and no, we've lost so much money, we've got to do X, Y, and Z, and let's, focus on the bottom line first. But I think that people's expectations of that will be different, and there'll be more requirement that if you want to engage me. The other thing I'm seeing so much improvisation. I watched a segment the other night on two nurses who had figured out how to make one ventilator mask serve 4 people. And they made a YouTube video and put it out there to try to teach other healthcare workers how to do that. So that level of improvisation on the front lines, which is where successful improvisation usually takes place, will also drive a demand for inclusive, not just structures, but behaviors in organizations, and recognition that the people on the front lines have so much embedded knowledge. How do we begin to translate that back into what we offer in the marketplace?
Well, and this gets back to the leadership theme. One of the things that I found with the research for my most recent book, which was about how organizations can anticipate and address strategic inflection points. So it's like, how do you see them? How do you decide what to do about them? And then how do you bring the organization with you? But one of the things that came across very clearly in that book was the messages that things are changing take place at the edges of your organization. They don't sort of present themselves in a neat package at the conference table at headquarters. And so how do you hear, those kinds of improvisation, those kinds of signals that things are really changing? A couple of the other assumptions that I think we're going to have to start rethinking are, take the age-old complaint about women being interrupted, or a woman has an idea and a man says the same thing 5 minutes later and it's received wisdom. And one of the interesting issues that I've been kind of noodling about is if we're doing this kind of communicating, and it's intermediated or it's moderated or everybody's got to take a turn, that sort of behavior is going to be much less prevalent, because we've got now this intervening infrastructure, which basically says, if I talk over you, nobody can hear, or if the moderator doesn't give everybody airtime, it's not going to be a successful meeting. And I wonder if this kind of communication style, if you will, is going to seep back into when we eventually, hopefully, turn back to face-to-face communications. I wonder if it'll have a lasting impact there.
That's something really interesting I hadn't thought about, that it may change our patterns of communication. We're getting more accustomed to communicating in forums like this, online in a way, and exactly the protocols of not, mute yourself when you're not talking. And how's that going to translate going forward into practices of, old-fashioned practices such as courtesy and listening? I think that there's a chance that it's not just that organizations will spontaneously say, oh, we need to get better at listening, and they say that already, and then are they not? Sometimes they are. It often depends on the leader behavior, but that there will be less tolerance for it among talented employees who will push for something else because they've seen the efficacy of more inclusive ways of and protocols for communicating. So I think that there will be some changes in those protocols, and it will be all to the good.
So you were telling me this morning you were on a call, and one of the participants was Frances Hesselbein.
Yes.
And I know she figured very prominently in some of your early work. What were sort of three or four things about her leadership style that really struck you at that point?
You know, one of the incidents, and I called up Frances out of the blue after I read a cover story that Peter Drucker had written in the old Conference Board magazine, talking about how he thought she was as good as any leader in the world, and he was recommending her to run General Motors. She was at that time National Executive Director of the Girl Scouts.
Wow.
And Frances, one of the things that struck me about Frances, too, I remember she had a meeting with a phone meeting with the New York Times. There was some controversy over Girl Scout cookies. And you know what she did in preparing for that? She not only prepared herself, but she brought in about 6 or 7 staffers, some of them at quite low levels, who were in various departments, communications, but other ones as well. Because what she was saying to them, this is how you handle an important call with the New York Times. So I thought it was so interesting because often younger staffers in organizations get no chance to actually see how their senior leaders, or in this case, their CEO, handle complicated calls. So that to me was such an inclusive kind of behavior. I remember also sitting in a meeting with her, and 2 of her direct reports, members of her web of inclusion, that first circle, were squabbling about something, and they turned to her and said, you know, what do you think? And she said, what I think is that you need to schedule some off time and resolve this among yourselves. I know you can do that, and then you'll come back and let me know what you came up with. So this trust that they could do this, and this unwillingness to micromanage or step in, or be with what our colleague Michael Bungay-Stanier calls an advice monster, was very impressive to me. And I was able to see demonstrated after that interview with Frances. I wrote the book, The Web of Inclusion. It was really based on the observation of her leadership style.
And you talked about her creating these circles. Could you
Yes.
elaborate on that? Because I think it's such an interesting concept, because we've got, I mean, what I observe today is companies have gotten very lean, spans of control have gotten very, very wide. And a lot of younger leaders, we used to have a system of trainer jobs, right? So you ran a department, and then maybe you ran a division, and then maybe you ran a country, and then you sort of learned leadership in a low risk, low cost way. And what I'm seeing today is that people are being put in roles that they're just not prepared for. And there's been no kind of training concept. And yet I think with this idea of increasing circles of I don't know what you want to call it, circles of organization, that may be a way of addressing some of these challenges.
I think that that's very true. I mean, when I first studied Frances I shadowed her. That's the method I used. And when I first did that, organizations were organized in a very hierarchical way, top down, with communication up and down a chain of command. We didn't have the technology we have now, and leaders communicated in a very isolated way. So it was fascinating to watch her, and what she laid out for me. And I remember we were having lunch at the Cosmopolitan Club in New York, and she was trying to describe her organization to me. So she started pulling knives and forks and salt and pepper shakers and everything, and showing me that what she really had was a web. And she said, I'm in the center, I'm not the top. She said, I draw people in around me, and I organize the people in the orbit so that they can learn from one another, and that I can be their support. And it was fascinating to see that, especially watching how our cultures and our organizational cultures evolved, where you don't have all that training. So you do need to see how people do things. You do need that access to be able to witness how excellence is demonstrated at a leadership level, which hierarchical organizations didn't provide. And also, so much of our work now is done in teams. And I think a webs of inclusion, both as a structure, which it was, but also as a practice. A web of inclusion is based on an inclusive practice and inclusive behaviors, such as she demonstrated. That really is where the team coordination can come in, and where how you manage teams. You really manage teams by giving them support and then getting out of their way.
And I think one of the interesting things about the current crisis is that we've almost got no choice, right? I mean, you can't be command and control in this sort of dispersed multinodal existence we're all sort of sharing. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about your most recent book. So it's been out for a year?
2 years next week.
Wow. Oh, it feels as though it was just yesterday.
I know.
That's amazing. So the book, for those of you that don't know, is called How Women Rise. And in the book, you're very specific about things that women do that hold themselves back, and how we can get past those things. And I think it would be just wonderful if you wouldn't mind